For today's topic, we're going to talk about excellent adventure equipment that can be found across the Underdark, with the goal of assisting beginners with fundamental character builds, get ideas for what gear to consider. This is a continuation from a previous video that tackled items found in the first map. I'll leave a link to it down in the description and on this screen. Before we step foot in the said area, we'll start off with a necklace found in the Defiled temple, a place that leads up to it where Ogre Poma hangs around. Inside the chest across the bed is the Amulet of Misty Step that gives a teleportation spell once every short rest. In our example here, I gave the accessory to Astarion, which I use every time a dangerous enemy gets up close. Even though he can fight well in such a distance, we know that he's most efficient when dealing with a foe from afar. If we use the disengage action, that would prevent us from attacking in the same turn. But Misty Step is a bonus action, which means he can simply teleport to a blind spot somewhere far away and snipe. As we enter the Selunite Outpost, the earliest piece of magical equipment we'll come across is a headgear for our paladin called Helmet of Smiting, which adds temporary hit points based on their charisma modifier every time a smite spell is used. This is very interesting because we now have an option to swap the Gloves of Heroism with something that adds to our offense. We'll get to that in a bit. In the room right next to where this helmet is found, there's a piece of gear called Luminous Armor that lights up surrounding enemies every time we land Radiant-based attacks. This will be very useful in the Shadow-Cursed lands, and there's actually a hammer which does exactly that, as you'll see later. From here, we can now confront the Spectator just outside to the west and retrieve its amulet called the Spectator Eyes, which gives us the ability to cast a Frighten and Necrotic attack spell every long rest. Just in case you're having a tough time with this creature, I posted a guide on how to get rid of it quite easily. In our example here, I gave the accessory to Gale because my simple strategy for him is to have access to as many spells as he can, beyond those that are known. This is why I let him keep in his inventory those equipment that have innate spells, like Rain Dancer and Staff of Crones, found on the first map, swapping them out as necessary. Northwest of the outpost, there's a longsword called Falar Aluv, which has a weapon ability that can either buff our party mates or debuff enemies in range, plus do 1 to 4 thunder damage per hit. In my current playthrough, I use this to replace the Sparky Point's Trident, and it serves really well when I need my paladin to fight defensively with a shield.
Shouldn't have made me your enemy.
From here, the next series of interesting gear are found at the Myconid colony, starting with a gnome named Thula. After we help and agree to rescue her captive clanmates, she will give us Boots of Speed that has an ability called Click Heels, which is very similar to Dash except it's a bonus action, and any foe who tried to do an opportunity attack has disadvantage. This is perfect for Astarion since he moves around a lot during fights, and it's also the reason why I switched his archetype to a Thief, because they have 2 bonus actions per round. Meanwhile, Blurg the Hobgoblin has several items that we can add to Gale's collection. There's Circlet of Blasting, which has Scorching Ray, and Melf's first staff that enables Acid Arrow. We also have an amulet called Psychic Spark that grants Magic Missile, but more importantly, it would release an additional projectile, regardless if it's from the amulet or a prepared one, and thus makes it more effective. He also has Boots of Genial Striding for sale, that smooths out walking on difficult terrain like mud. Since Astarion already has a Boots of Speed, and my 2 melee fighters mostly rely on jumping to move around during fights, I also gave this to Gale.
Very well.
If you have an Eldritch Knight or a Warlock in your party, there's a short sword tailor-made for them called the Baneful. It does bonus damage when bound to them and can possibly bane a foe on hit. In my opinion, any weapon that can debuff an enemy as a bonus is worth using. I tested this out on Will and it's really good. Across the encampment from Blurg, there's another seller by the name of Derryth. Two of the items she's peddling are perfect additions to Shadowheart's gear. First is the Amulet of Restoration that adds 2 additional healing spells every long rest. When combined with the Herbalist's Gloves, any healing action now doubles as an antidote because it will also remove poison status. She also has a couple of interesting rings for sale, one of which is Caustic Band, a ring that adds 2 acid damage to any weapon hits. Since Astarion is my main physical attack dealer, I gave it to him. The other is Ring of Jumping, which has an innate spell that would triple an adventurer's jumping distance, perfect for when a high-strength character needs to reach a faraway spot. In my rogue's current set, his melee weapon isn't that remarkable, but thankfully there's a weapon called Short Sword of First Blood that would be perfect for him. It can be found on an executed gnome south of the colony, and what it does is add an additional 1 to 8 piercing damage if the target is at full HP. So if we combine this with a headgear named Shadow of Menzoberranzan, a reward from Sovereign Spa after we finish the Dwargar Intruders quest, we are looking at a great combo for landing a melee sneak attack, because it can make its wearer invisible once every short rest.
Tricks. I'll just help myself.
One of the targets in that intruder elimination quest is a slave hunter Dwargar named Gek, and he has in possession of something called Exterminator's Axe, a 2-handed weapon that does an additional 1 to 6 fire damage to plants, insects, or small creatures. There will be groups of enemies in the Shadow-Cursed lands that belong in these categories, so keep this weapon close at hand. Earlier in the video, I mentioned something that could replace our Paladin's Gloves of Heroism, and it's a reward from Derryth after we rescue her husband. It's called Gloves of Uninhibited Kushigo, which increases any thrown weapon's damage by 1 to 4. When combined with the returning pike and Ring of Flinging, its attack rating is tremendous. I use it all the time. The next 2 items are connected through a quest from Omalium, and it involves going inside the Arcane Tower to retrieve a couple of ingredients. While we're there, we should talk to Bernard to retrieve the Guiding Light Ring, which grants the light cantrip to its wearer. This of course will be very useful as we go through the Shadow-Cursed lands, as it's recommended that at least 2 of our party mates should be lit up to keep everyone safe. Once we've returned to Omalium and finished the quest, he now has several items to trade for, including an amulet called Pearl of Power, which can restore any expended spell slots, similar to Arcane Recovery of Wizards. He also has Ring of Salving, that adds 2 additional HP to any healing action, and as I've talked about in the previous video, healers in this game are well supported by a lot of magical gear, and this trinket bolsters it. Before we move on to the next portion of the Underdark, now is a good time for us to finish the Mastercraft weapon that involves using Susur Bark. We can imbue the anti-magic property on a greatsword, dagger, or sickle. Personally, I chose the dagger because we already have several great 2-handed weapons to choose from, and it's the most versatile among the 3, with the added option of being thrown if necessary. With that finished, we can now take a boat ride to access the next area. The first item here is found on a corpse of a deep gnome, east of the Grymforge Waypoint. It's a ring called Caladuran's Smooth Hands that grants an invisibility spell once every long rest. In my playthrough, I gave it to Gale so he can evade an up-close foe or use it on a party mate if necessary. Up next are 3 weapons sold by Corsair Greymon, the Dwergar who jumped aboard our boat. If we want access to these items, we must make sure not to shove him overboard, even though it's quite tempting to do. First off, we have Jorgorl's Greatsword, a 2-handed weapon that's slightly more powerful than the ones we currently have, and also has an action that does decent damage in a line. I, however, still prefer the returning pike because it's more versatile and does greater damage when thrown. There's also Bow of the Banshee that can frighten enemies on hit, and is a good alternative to the Herald Crossbow. However, its damage is only up to par if a target is already frightened, so we're basically trading off Bane in exchange for Frighten, as well as a substantial amount of maximum damage for it. Both are very useful depending on the type of foe. In the early portion of this presentation, I talked about the Luminous Armor, and this is the weapon that should go well with it. A light hammer called Shining Staver of Skulls, which does a bonus 1-4 radiant damage, and would trigger the armor's passive ability. It's an excellent combination when fighting the creatures in the next area. However, I think there's a bug with this weapon because, as you can see here, it emits light by itself, but when we get to the ruined battlefield, it's gone. So we need to make sure that Shadowheart has the light cantrip, and the guiding light ring I talked about earlier on another, so everyone's protected.
Sol Invictus! No time to rest.
The last 2 items for today's video is courtesy of Nair, a very dangerous magic user. So I equipped Shadowheart with the Susur Dagger and pressure attacked him with it, while Astarion sniped from above. In his possession is an excellent pair of boots called Disintegrating Night Walkers that prevents its wearer from getting slowed or snagged, and also grants Misty's Step spell. In my case, I gave it to the Paladin, but obviously it's quite useful to anyone in our group. The other item is a rapier called Sword of Screams that does a bonus 1-4 psychic damage, and is a good replacement for Astarion's melee weapon we covered earlier. It almost has the same attack rating, except unconditional. Technically, there are several items unaccounted for, but the ones mentioned here are those readily accessible to adventurers at level 5 to 6. With these equipment in mind, I think we're now better prepared to face the Shadow Curse. Good luck.